In this video, we will be implementing the task model. The task model is used to store the task data when you retrieve it from the database or when you're creating a new task. We can have multiple task objects depending on how many tasks we are returning. Each task will be in its own object. This model will handle the validation of a valid task. For example, mandatory fields and valid data values. So let's get started. First thing we need to do is create the task model file. So in Atom, on the left hand side you've got your model in your folder structure. So if I right click on model, new file, and we'll call this one task. Task.php. Okay, so create PHP. The first thing we're going to do is extend the exception class. Now what we want to do is throw valid task exceptions. So we use this to handle different types of errors or possible errors within the task. So for example, mandatory fields. So if someone forgets to type a title, we can throw a task exception. And because it's a specific type of exception, we can catch it. We've seen an example of this within the database class that we created previously. So we're not going to do anything exciting with this task exception class, only define it. We just need to be able to handle it. So class, we'll call it task exception, and it'll extend, because we're subclassing exception, extend exception. Now like I say, it is just an empty class, so we can just leave it like that. So we need to create the task class. Let's create some space. For each task you have certain data that you store about the task. So this is what we're going to do here. So we need to implement these variables to store this data. So the first one was every task has an ID, so private ID. And the next one was title, private title, and it had a description. Private description. It had a deadline. And it had a completed status. So now that we've got places to store this data for the task, we now need to create your normal getters and setters. So we'll quickly do that now. First one is to get the ID. So these are public, function get ID. Obviously the getters, so we're not passing any arguments in. And all we're doing is return this underscore ID. So let's get ID. So we need to do the same for get title, get description, get deadline, and get completed. So we'll just quickly run through these. Get title, return this title. Let's get title done. Public function get description. Return this description. So that's that one done. The next one is deadline. Get deadline. Return this deadline. And the last one is completed. I'll just scroll down a little bit so we can see where we're at. Return this underscore completed. Okay, we'll just double check. So we'll get the ID, return underscore this ID, public function get title, so that returns the title, returns underscore title, get description, this underscore description, get deadline, return this underscore deadline, and completed. Yep, that looks all okay. So now move on to the setters. So the first one is set ID. This will be taking an ID value. Now the setters are the ones that's going to contain the validation for the values to make sure things are set as they should, like mandatory fields and data value types and things like that. So the first thing we need to do is check the values coming in. So if so the ID we won't be setting, it will be generated from the database, but still need to validate on that just to make sure it's valid. Now the valid values coming from the database are values greater than 0 but less than 9 quintillion. If you remember rightly, 9 quintillion was the big int maximum value that you could store in the database or the MySQL column. So we just need to make sure that it doesn't exceed that. And I guess we need to make sure that we're not trying to overwrite an ID value, because once it's set, it should never change. So we need to perform that checking in there. There is certain circumstances where the ID will be null, so the passed in ID will be null, and that is where we're creating a new task, because up until that point it won't have an ID. It's only when it gets inserted in the database that it will, so we need to allow for that. So I guess the first thing we need to do is to try and check to make sure the value is not null to begin with. So the passed in value for ID is not null, but obviously it can be null, so we need to put a differentiating factor in here. So if we put this in brackets and we do a check, so if it's not null, and then do your check on your data that's passed in. So if it's not null, we need to make sure it's numeric. Numeric ID, and what else do we need to check? Or if the ID is less than or equal to 0, because a new auto increment in the database starts at 1, so it's 1 and above, or the max value, so the ID is greater than, and I've got the number noted down because it's absolutely massive, 922233720368547758807. So that's the 9 quintillion number, the max for the database column size. And we'll also need to check, like I said before, that we can't change this ID if it's already set. So if we're trying to pass something in and this ID is not null, so that looks fine. I think I'm missing an end bracket there. Yep, I am. So what we're doing here is, if the passed in value is not null, because obviously it can be null if we don't have a value at the moment, because it's generated by the database. So only if it's not null, then it does the check on the data type that's passed in. So we need to make sure that it is numeric, but going by the exception, it's not numeric, or it's less than or equal to 0, because auto increment starts at 1, or the ID is greater than the maximum size that can store in the database. And the other check is to make sure that if it's not null, as in if the task already has an ID, we can't change it. So if we then, what we do is throw new task exception, and then what we do is we pass in an error message here, task ID error. Because if you remember rightly, we look up here, task exception, we have this to catch our own exceptions. So we copy, subclass exception, that should be extends. Just make sure you change that to extends, made a bit of a typo there. It extends exception to allow us to throw our own specific task exception. So we can throw a new task exception and pass in an error message that will then be able to display it to the end user if we put it in our standard response messages going back. So throw a new task exception. Otherwise, we need to set this ID equals ID. Okay, like I said, these ones are a little bit complicated. I mean, you can put your own logic in here. This is obviously just for my specific needs here, but you put your own logic in here. But I'm just showing you how to, if there is an invalid value that you're putting in, this is how you would handle the error. So I'll just save that. Okay, the next one is function ID. So it's a title. So public function set title. I'll pass in a title. And then on the database, we have a maximum character size for the column of 255 characters. So we need to make sure that's in there. But also what we need to do is to make sure that because this is mandatory, a title is mandatory, so we'll have to make sure that it is set. So we will do our if statement. And we'll use a function called string length, so str len, and we'll pass in the passed in title. So what we're saying here, if string length is less than 0, so if it doesn't have a length, for example it's blank, then obviously we'll throw the exception. The other thing we need to check is string len, obviously passed in, title is greater than 255 characters. So if it's less than 0 or if it's greater than 255, we need to throw an error message. So throw new task exception with an error message of task title error. Otherwise, if it's valid data, this title equals passed in title. Okay, so that's set title. Next one's description. So set description, and we'll pass in a description. Description, make sure I spell that right. Description. And we need to check, well, this can be optional, so we need to make sure we handle that. And the description, we had a maximum size, I think it was set a medium text in MySQL, which has a maximum size of something like 16.7 million characters. So we need to handle that. So if, so what we need to say is if it's not null, I guess, is the first thing we need to do. So we'll put this in brackets. So description is not null. And so if the is passed in data, then yeah, so then we need to make sure that the size, a bit like the title, the size is correct. So and what we'll do here is put this in brackets as well, because this is two compound sort of logic statement here. So string length, we'll always do that, length, description is less than, actually it's optional, so we need to handle that. So maximum of 16.777215, so that's 16.7 characters, and we'll close that. I think that's right. Let's just think about the logic here. So if we're passing a description, we need to check, because it can be optional, so it might not be the case, and we need to check that the length is not greater than 16.777. Okay, that should be fine. We'll pass in the error message, task exception, task description error. Otherwise, we'll set this description as passed in description. So this underscore description, passed in description. So that should be right. So if it's not null and greater than that, then it throws the exception. Yep, that should be fine. Next one is the deadline, but what we'll do, we'll come back to that because a little bit more advanced, that one. So we'll move on to the completed one, and we'll come back to deadline in a second. So public function set completed. And the valid characters is Y and N for this, if you remember rightly. So we need to do a check for that. Now we're not bothered whether they are uppercase or lowercase. So what we'll do is we'll pass in any value and we'll convert that to an uppercase, just so we can handle consistency across the board. So str to upper, this is a standard PHP function that converts a string to uppercase. Completed, and what we'll say is if it's not equal to Y, and important and here, and exactly the same, string to upper completed is not equal to no. So we're saying here, if the value passed in is not a Y and it is not an N, then throw the error. So throw new task exception, and we will say task completed must be Y or N. Okay, that's fine. Obviously if it passes M validation, then we'll set, so this underscore completed equals completed. So that's set complete. So now what we need to do is do the deadline one. This is a little bit more advanced because there's a bit more logic in this one. So create the function. Set deadline. We will be passing in a deadline string, and we'll set our if statement up, and also if it's successful, we will set the deadline to the passed in deadline. Okay, so if it's not successful, we'll throw new task exception, pass in a string, task deadline date or time. Oh, just put date time error. I think that's good enough. So the first thing we need to do is check to make sure, because this is obviously this can be optional. So we need to check if it has a value. So a bit like what we did with the description there. So we'll double check. So passed in deadline is not equal to null. And then what we'll do here is then do the check on the date and time. Now here we will try and create a date from the passed in deadline. Obviously that comes in as a string, just text. And then what we'll do is we'll try and convert it back to a string from a date and just make sure that the values match. Just make sure there's no funny business going on the conversion. So PHP has a couple of functions that can help us with this, and the first one, we need to create the date. So date create from format, takes two arguments. First one is a mask, which is like the format that we've supplied. So that would be date, month, year, hour, minute. The second one is obviously the passed in variable. So that would be deadline. So that tries to create the date. I'm just going to put some spaces here just so we can see what we're doing. So now that we've got the date, we need to convert it back. So instead of making this absolutely like massively long, I'm just going to call it from the other function that we're doing the conversion back. So I'm just creating some space because I just want to make it clear about what we're actually doing here. So the other function which converts a date back to text is date format, and then this takes two parameters. The first being the date object. So what we'll do, we'll put that in a second. because this function creates the object. So we'll just use that within this function. So the second argument is the mask this time. So we'll just want to try and convert it back to the same type just to do the comparison. So that would be date, month, year, hour, minute, sorry. And then what I want to do is compare this to make sure that it's the same. So if it's not the same as the passed in deadline, so if there's any conversion issue that's happened here, and the values don't then match back, then it's an issue. So what we'll do here, I've only put this over here just to make it a bit clearer. We'll just move this, so we'll cut this and we'll put it in as the first argument. Like I said, that is a date object. So it was just to make it clearer really. So we'll just get rid of this white space here. That should be our deadline function check here. Everything looks okay. So if it's not, so if it has a value, it tries to create a date following this format of the passed in string. Then what it does is converts it back to a string, or tries to convert the date object back to a string using this format. And then what we do is do a comparison check to make sure that the passed in deadline is the same as the conversion of the date. It just makes sure that it is actually converting the date to and back to again, and it's fine. So now that we've got all of the setter methods done, what we need to do is create a construct method. Let's create some space up here. Now construct method allows you to, and it's a standard PHP, it's what's called a magic method. It allows you to create a new object by just saying new, say, task with parameters in. Otherwise you'd have to do something like task new task and then run the setter methods on it. So you'd write task set title and then obviously pass in a title here. So we don't want to do that because it's just messy. It'd be nice if we can just do new task and then pass in the arguments that we need here. And then title here, description here. You get the point. So that's what we're going to do. So the constructor allows this to happen. So it's public function, and then because it's a PHP magic method, it's 2 underscores, so 2 underscores, and then it's called construct. We'll be passing in some values, which is your ID, your title. So we'll just quickly type these in now, just so we can use them. Title, description, deadline, completed. And then all we're going to do is take these and run them through the setter methods to do our validation basically. So what we need to do is call the setter methods. So this set ID, ID, and then we'll pass in the ID. So this set title, pass in the title. This set, not deadline, description, and then pass in description. Now we can do this set deadline, pass in the deadline, and the last one, this set completed, and then pass in the completed. Okay, so now that we've got that, so we can create the objects, set ID, title, description, deadline, completed. That's all the variables here. So we can do that. Okay, the next thing we need to do is be able to sort of transform this object into something that's friendly for the JSON encode that we'll be using when we send the response back. So obviously you can't have tasks included in that. So what we need to do is create a helper method to allow the format to be nicely or easily used within the response. So what we want to do is convert it into an array, and from the response lesson it demonstrate that an array can be then properly or nicely formatted into JSON just by using the JSON encode function. So we're just going to create a helper method, public function return task as array. It's not going to take any arguments because all the details are already in this object. So we need to create a task array and then set the data. So the first one's ID equals this get ID. Task title equals this get title. Task description equals this get description. Oops. Deadline equals this get deadline, and should be the last one. Task completed equals this get completed. And then we need to obviously return it, so we need to return this array, which is called task. Okay, so hopefully that should be all we need to do in this model. So to test it, we're going to do what we did with the response. We're going to create a test file to try and create a task and return it to client, basically. So in order to do that, we're just going to create it in model because we are going to delete it. Right click model, new file, and we'll call it task test.php. Create a PHP start tag. So first thing we need to do is we need to call in the file, the task file. So require once, because it's in the same folder, I can just call task.php. And then we need to try and create the task. Now, if you remember, the task can potentially fail. It can throw a new exception. Where exceptions are concerned, you need to try and catch them, if you remember. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to try and create a task. If it fails, we're going to try and catch the exception. So try and then catch, and we specify the type of exception we are looking for, and that's a task exception. We'll give it a name so we can utilize the message that we'll pass in, which is task ID error, for example. And all we're going to do is just echo out to the client error, and then we're going to append the message. So the exception class has a function already to get this passed in message, and it's called a get message. It's that simple. So we'll just call it get message, and that's all we need to do to handle that. So now we need to try and actually create one. So task equals new, and obviously you remember that we created the constructor, so we can just say new task and then pass in the values. So we're going to try and create a task that is successful, so valid data. So one title here, description here, deadline, which is a date, so I'll just say 01/01/2019, 12 o'clock. And then the last one is completed, and I'm just going to say no to that for the time being. So we'll also test our return task as array and try and convert it to JSON just to give it a whole test. So because we're returning JSON, remember, we have to set the header so the client knows what type of data it is that's coming back. So remember, that was content type application /JSON char set equals UTF-8 for this one. And we'll then need to call the JSON encode and echo the JSON data out. So echo JSON encode, and we need to say task, and then we need to get it as an array. So we need to get the task as an array. So return task as array. Remember our function that we created. So what we should be able to do now is use Postman to try and retrieve this task that we've created. So make sure MAMP's running, open Postman, type in our URL, folder structure, so it's version 1, and we've stored it in model / task test.php. It's a standard GET request, so I've clicked send. So you can see there that we've actually got a successful response. We've got the task back in a nice formatted way. So we've got the ID, the title, and you can see there that's picked the values up. So what we need to do now is just to test that, make sure some of the validation's working and that we get a valid sort of error response. So if we go back into our test file and change some of this data so we know that it's invalid, we should get an error message this time. So we know that a task ID should be greater than 0 because that's what we said in our code here. So set ID, it's got to be greater than 0 basically. So if we set that to 0 and just save it and then try and run it, we should get an error message. There you go, task ID error. So the error is actually working, which is good. So if we set it back and then just try some other data, we'll just take the completion status out because, you know, we said that it has to be a Y or an N. So if we just leave it blank and save that and then try and run it. So you can see there we're getting the error message. Obviously, depending on what the error is, it changes. So we'll just say that back to N, and what we'll do, we'll just try and put in, you know, a date that's incorrect. So we'll just try and change the month to 20. So obviously there's only 12 months, so in theory this should fail. So we'll save that. Run it again, and you can see there the task date time error has sort of been outputted. So that's looking good. Looks like the validation's working. We're sort of responding back or returning it as sort of JSON. We should be good to move on to the controller now. So the controller is where all the logic goes, basically API. It's the fundamentals of it. This will be split up amongst sort of different videos depending on what part of functionality that we're implementing. So now that we've done with this, we can close this and delete it because we don't need it. So we'll delete task test. We'll just right click and delete. So, okay, I'll see you in the next video.